I'd like to focus on the role and relationship between the government and the rest of us in our shared commitment to addressing the climate crisis and achieving net zero. A government can generally expect its fair share of the more usual complications, such as a recession, problems in the housing market, and perhaps even a financial crisis. A major incident like the current pandemic is thankfully something much rarer. But that also means we have less understanding of how to respond and little time to prepare. To add to the difficulty, decisions about how to address a rapidly evolving situation need to be made quickly, and often on the basis of incomplete information and varying opinions. It's therefore potentially valuable to look at our response to the COVID-19 pandemic and assess how it might also inform our strategy for achieving net zero on, or preferably ahead of schedule. It's probably true to say that the threat the pandemic represents is rather more immediate to many than the consequences of what we're still doing to our natural environment, and by extension, of course, ourselves. There was therefore an urgency in our response to COVID that we've yet to see in policy aimed at achieving net zero. That clearly needs to change. As a result, I think there's a lot we can learn from the way that so many institutions and individuals accepted the challenge brought by COVID-19. We networked and cooperated as a matter of urgency to find ways of getting the UK through the crisis, each providing their own particular capabilities and skill set. Those institutions included government because there are certain things that only a government can do, particularly when it comes to supporting the development, testing, approval, and distribution of vaccines, and the funding of new medical equipment in an emergency situation. The government also enabled logistical support from the armed forces when the NHS's privatized global supply chains broke down under the pressure. And it's the only institution that can change the legal framework. But the government on its own cannot easily reverse engineer a CPAP-assisted breathing device, build a prototype, vastly improve its performance, and then have it in production within weeks, and finally open source the design for global use. However, in response to the government's call for assistance during the COVID crisis, Formula One teams, working with universities, health organizations, and other specialist businesses, did all that and more. The rapid evolution of these task-focused networks with a can-do approach, and often with a university at their core, helped the UK to develop its response to the pandemic. The international scramble to import vital supplies that were suddenly in hot demand but short supply helped to kickstart the search for locally sourced alternatives. In other words, things had to be done differently and at pace. All this demonstrates that targeted government policy and cooperation with other institutions is essential to successfully address crises that demand such major change, and this includes the achievement of net zero. A good example is the fundamental role played by the Danish government in the transformation of Danish oil and natural gas, Dong for short. Dong was once responsible for some 30% of Denmark's CO2 emissions, but now, less than a decade later, it's changed its name to Ørsted, one of Denmark's best-known scientists and innovators, and it's a £25 billion renewables company that provides many green jobs. Similarly, in the UK, policy change will mean the end of gas-powered boilers in new-build houses from 2025. However, although essential, policy is not in itself sufficient. It must be supported and partly shaped by those already addressing the many areas where we'll need to do things differently. Numerous innovative ideas are emerging from both private companies and universities, like use of the new Dearman engine-powered chillers to replace diesel equivalents in the supply chain for refrigerated food. The vastly more efficient solar panels being developed by Oxford PV, and Zero Petroleum's harvesting of gases from the atmosphere to produce a circular petrol economy, to name but a few. Some or all of these, and many others, will provide mechanisms to help get to net zero. But driving that change will need all of us to help make it happen. This was evident in the way the NHS and local volunteers have managed to make the vaccination process as slick as a Formula One pit stop. Without their skills and adaptability, the UK's vaccination policy could easily have fallen flat at the last hurdle. Achieving net zero will therefore also require many different people to initiate change as well as drive it, and some are already doing just that. Much of my research centers around policy, so I'm very aware that some communities are happy to develop and implement their own solutions locally. For example, in England alone, there are some 2.8 million homes, usually in rural villages, that will be unaffected by the banning of gas-fired central heating, having never been connected to mains gas. Of these, around 14% are classified as energy poor. Some of these villages, including several in my home county of Cambridgeshire, are tackling these problems themselves in ways that will also contribute to net zero. The village of Reach, for example, has its own community solar farm, which generates sufficient power to serve 50 homes, or roughly half the village. Since it's a community project run through a community benefit society, they can fund and manage it according to their own needs. In this case, 112 local people bought shares to raise the £345,000 of funding required, and the project went ahead. The residents of Gamlingay, another Cambridgeshire village, took a somewhat different route away from expensive and polluting heating oil. Their solution is renewable energy generated by a modern wind turbine, this time funded through investment in Bitcoin. But perhaps the most ambitious scheme so far is that at Swaffham Prior, a village of around 300 homes on the edge of the Fens. Heating Swaffham Prior is a partnership between Cambridgeshire County Council and the Swaffham Prior Community Land Trust. It will use ground source heat backed up by electrode boilers which run on renewable energy during very cold weather and other times of high demand. To prevent fuel poverty, a key consideration is that household income will not be a barrier to joining the system. Given that the scheme will help to address energy poverty and inequality, save around 47,000 tons of carbon over its projected lifetime, and that there are around 10,000 homes reliant on heating oil in the Cambridgeshire area alone, it really does make you wonder whether we should be thinking about net zero at all. With informed and ambitious policy, new technology, and community action like this, should we not be aiming for net gain instead? In short, a response to the climate crisis is not just a question of government policy and targets like net zero. It needs to involve us all, an idea that builds upon what we do here at Birkbeck.